Okay, so today we are talking with Alex Clinton, a pre-doctoral student at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. He conducted research out of the University of West Virginia and was first author on a paper entitled "Using Positive Empathy Interventions to Reduce Stigma Toward People Who Inject Drugs." Okay, so my first question is just generally, how did you as a researcher get into psychology and addiction, and more specifically research into these topics like stigma?
Right, that's a great question. So I started my undergrad by just being a psychology major because generally it seemed like something that was cool to do, and I was still trying to figure out, what it is I really kind of wanted to do. And so eventually I took a social psychology class. The professor at Fairfield University, where I went to school, his name is Dr. Michael Andrachik. He ended up becoming my kind of undergraduate mentor. But the kinds of questions that we were asking and kind of investigating in that social psychology class kind of really spoke to me, and I found really interesting. Things like, where do attitudes come from? What are ways to change attitudes? Are your behaviors affected by any different things that you might hold? Things like bias, things like empathy, stigma, and all these kind of more latent constructs in kind of investigating the relationship between those. And I thought that was very interesting. So I had talked to Dr. Andrachik and said, "Hey, do you have any opportunities to work with you on any projects like this?" And then that blossomed into a great undergraduate mentorship, and that kind of jump-started my journey towards kind of being a social psychologist by nature, and that's kind of mostly where my interests lie. I ended up doing some work in undergrad related to empathy and how one could manipulate empathy to achieve changes in attitudes and behaviors. So we did some work in undergrad of using positive empathy as opposed to traditional negative empathy to see if we could get people to change their scores on an implicit association test across racial lines. So if I give you some kind of positive empathetic stimuli, will you show less implicit bias or less bias in general towards a certain group that you'd be more likely to show bias towards if I didn't give you that kind of manipulation or stimuli whatsoever? And so that was very interesting work, and that was great. And then I moved on to West Virginia University as a research assistant for some of their different projects based in Massachusetts. And one of the projects was on opioid use and trying to provide naloxone to people who use opioids, and kind of assessing the barriers and facilitators to naloxone access. And one of the barriers and facilitators that came up just in investigating the project was stigma, that this idea of stigma, either perceived, experienced, or felt, was a barrier to people getting naloxone, which is the life-saving, almost like an EpiPen, but for overdose, for anyone who doesn't know. And so in that, I kind of started to think about my previous research experiences, and eventually I talked to my PI in that project, Dr. Robin Pollini, about, hey, is there any room here to do a different project or a more traditional research paper on how we could use empathy to reduce stigma, which might help boost access and kind of decrease barriers to different services for people who use opioids. And that whole kind of idea and that snowball eventually became this paper, which is very nice.
Yeah, it is. It's a very interesting paper.
Thank you.
Is this type of like stigma research and the kind of underrepresented group research something that you want to continue throughout the rest of your career and then your rest of your studies and everything?
Yeah, that's definitely a segment of my interests. I think mostly the empathy stuff is kind of where I find most of my interest lying. But naturally, when you use empathy to achieve some kind of good, that good that you're trying to achieve is very often going to fall in lines with trying to help marginalized or stigmatized groups of a bunch of different things. There's opportunities to do it for like women in the workplace, right? If they're experiencing any kind of bias there, people who use opioids across racial lines. There's the reason I like the empathy stuff as a more generalized category is that there's a lot of different and interesting applications that you can use it for without kind of pigeonholing yourself to one specific population in just the kind of specific scenarios that go with that one population.
So do you find that empathy is kind of underrepresented in the research? Like it's newly studied or there's just not enough research on it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a very nuanced distinction, which is kind of where I make my mark. So I don't think empathy is underrepresented in the literature.
Okay.
I think positive empathy is underrepresented in the literature. There's a lot of, when you think of empathy as a construct, it's a sort of, a feeling for someone else. And so in the literature, there's a ton of work on what the literature just calls empathy. So they don't distinguish. They just say this is empathy intervention. But really what it is I give you a scenario and I say to you, hey, wouldn't it suck to be this person? Isn't this really bad? Think of how terrible this person feels. Think of how terrible their life experiences are. Think of how terrible the situation now is. And then I say to you, and okay, now rate this person on a kind of attitudinal scale, right? And so they call that empathy, just empathy. But really what that is negative empathy, is I'm making you feel bad for that person. I'm priming you with negative emotions of sympathy, support giving, things like that. And so that type of empathy has been shown in the literature to be distinct from positive empathy, which is the opposite. So instead of saying, feel so bad about this person, instead, hey, I had a great day at work. What kind of feelings would you give me to celebrate my great day at work? And that idea is called capitalization, the idea that you're taking something good that happens and you're capitalizing on that idea, that emotion, that feeling. And so that's manipulating empathy as well, but it's a very different kind of empathy than the negative support giving empathy. And so I think that nuanced distinction of between different types of empathy is really where I think there's avenues and a gap in the literature to kind of address future studies. So I think that specific type is underrepresented. And I think part of the problem is how much research on empathy is kind of intertwined in is really negative empathy, but no one really kind of susses out that distinction.
Yeah, so do you find that there's a lot of pushback with the idea of positive empathy, or challenges that like people bring about because it's a newer idea?
Yeah, I think with anything in doing research in psychology or even research in any field, really, I think there's a value to bringing something new to the field that hasn't been researched before. However, there's an innate amount of difficulty with supporting that new research because the lack of ability to cite previous work. And that's a lot how people write papers, is they see previous work and they take a little step forward. And then that's how they keep, they take little steps forwards for, 50 years and they retire and then they're tenured and whatever. But it's tough when you do something that is not very well represented in the literature, because it's easy for someone to say, well, hold on, no one's done that before. So how can you know this would work? There's no reason to give you funding because you can't prove that this would be a good strategy, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that pushback is natural and it makes sense in terms of being good skeptics, being good scientists, making sure that everyone does their due diligence for research work. But I think the key to kind of combating that pushback is connecting how this kind of empathy intervention is really not totally new. It's really an offshoot of the work that has been proven to be good and has been, cited and studied for a long time. And really, it's just twisting it in a new direction as opposed to a completely new line of work, if that makes sense.
Okay, so at the institutions like University of Massachusetts as well as West Virginia University, was there a lot of researchers that were working on similar things? So you had support in this, or were you kind of like, you and your mentor were kind of out on your own trying to figure out what to do?
Yeah, so at West Virginia and at UMass Lowell, it's both a similar scenario in which a lot of the people who I worked with at West Virginia and who I hope to work with in the future at UMass Lowell, their research is more in just strictly bias of the various types, or stigma of various types, like workplace stigma, kind of stigma in education, and the empathy thing is really kind of what I'm bringing to the table as there's a bunch of people who work on trying to reduce bias and stigma for obvious reasons, and they're doing different methodologies, but really my interest in empathy is really kind of bringing to the table now you've tried to reduce it in these other ways. What if you've tried reducing it in this way? How could this work to kind of further your research in any different way? And so that was how I got that funding for the paper, and the project at West Virginia was kind of suggesting that empathy might be a good intervention technique for reducing stigma. And as I continue in my doctoral degree at UMass Lowell, that's how I hope to kind of link up with other faculty who's doing similar research in bias and stigma and try to see if I can use empathy as a technique to reduce it.
Yeah. So with this paper specifically, you obviously look at stigma with a specific group. So you look at people who inject drugs, which is specific on multiple folds. So is there a reason you guys chose people who inject drugs versus just using drugs writ large?
Right. So in the project that we did, so the grant that funded both my work at West Virginia and that ended up funding this project as well was looking at specifically injection drug users as a more at-risk population than just kind of general drug users. And so when crafting this paper and doing this methodology, I thought it was important for both being in line with the grant and the work we were doing outside of this paper, but also for the research as well, that if we're going to look at a kind of a specifically vulnerable population of people who inject drugs as opposed to people who use drugs writ large, that I think the work into helping that stigma, I think, is not more important, but also important, and it ties in with some of the other interests or whatever as well.
Do you think that there's an increased stigma with this group of like the people who inject drugs, even like people who use pills, like there's increased stigma on injection just because of like different class structures and that kind of thing?
Right. So I think I'll preface this by saying that I'm not an epidemiologist or anyone who does anything with drug-related research, right? So this is what I know from having done a paper in the topic, but it seems from my work at West Virginia on the grant fund, the project, but it seems from my previous experience, it seems like people who use drugs is a very broad category, right? If you were to smoke marijuana, for example, right? That's a person who uses drugs. But I think there's a very sharp line for public perception when you get to people who inject drugs, which typically is riskier drugs in more risky environments. And this is all on average, right? In the aggregate, right? But, and I think like you had said, class structure, the types of ways in which you see these people, who you would assume these people to look like, whether wrongly or whatnot, that I think that leads to more stigma, because the idea that people who take painkillers, for example, I think the general assumption is, oh, they have a good reason, they were prescribed, they must have gotten injured, whereas people who inject drugs, I think they don't get any of those benefit outs or any of those alternative reasons as to why they might be in their situation. Instead, it jumps right to this person is a drug addict or some other kind of stigmatized or harmful word, right?
Yeah, and so that kind of gets at like the outgroup idea, which you talked about in your paper. These are more of an outgroup that someone can't empathize with as much.
Right. Because if you think about it, right, if you're someone who tried weed in high school, right, you might consider yourself a person who uses drugs. And so if you were to say, oh, I think of people who use drugs, yeah, I smoke every now and again, so that's like me. So that's not really going to be an outgroup, which doesn't mean you wouldn't stigmatize people in your in-group, but you could especially think about people who inject drugs of, oh, I've never done that and never would, how shameful, or some other kind of harmful, stigmatized or generalized attitude about a whole, heterogeneous group.
Yeah, and another key concept of your paper that I found kind of interesting, but, could be defined for everyone else is emotional exhaustion and how that leads to like a lack of empathy or a decrease in empathy. Could you explain that idea a little bit better, and then, or for everyone else, and not that it wasn't good in the paper, but for everyone not reading the paper, and how that can translate to like everyday interactions.
Right, and so that was an important part of the paper because it helped to kind of illustrate a little bit more clearly how this stigma might happen for someone who might consider themselves not stigmatizing at all, or someone who would hold, egalitarian views about everyone across racial lines, behaviors, everything. And I think that part really kind of illustrated how this stigma might be perpetuating even amongst people who hold those types of views. And so emotional exhaustion is essentially the idea that if every day you go to work and you experience traffic, for the first day, it's just traffic, it's fine. For the second day, it's traffic, it's fine. But after you get into a month, 2 months, 3 months where it's traffic, your kind of tolerance for handling something that you consider annoying, unpleasant, that it starts to lower, because obviously you get exhausted in dealing with this different thing. And so this idea of emotional exhaustion is that same concept, but applied to empathy. So if someone comes to you and says, hey, I'm struggling, and you help them, and you go, okay, great, we're struggling to help them. But if this person keeps struggling, if this person keeps coming to you, keeps kind of draining your resources, your cognitive resources, and you keep needing to help this person over and over again, if you have to take time out of your day, if it's inconvenient for any way, your cognitive resources into handling or being able to provide empathy for somebody starts to drain, because it keeps happening over and over again. And so you get into this scenario where someone who is both motivated to not be stigmatizing and motivated to help people who are stigmatized against can start to develop and hold those stigmatizing views, because their resources, their will, their tolerance starts to lower due to kind of repeated attempts. And so this idea of emotional exhaustion essentially is saying that the more negative someone's scenario is, especially if that scenario is repeated over time, the less likely people are to show empathy or helping behaviors due to the kind of resource strain that it would bring on the person trying not to stigmatize or trying to help. And given that life is complex enough and there's so much things going on, and COVID and work and life and family, that taking on incredibly negative or incredibly taxing attitudes, beliefs, projects, helping behaviors starts to become much more of a chore as that goes on. And so that kind of is a framework for which you can see, okay, even a very nice, egalitarian person might start to stigmatize people just because it gets hard not to with such, overtly negative events and behaviors.
Yeah, and so you can kind of see from that definition, especially, how it could translate even to people who are trained, like highly trained, like clinicians,
right,
mental health field.
Right,
so
and that's actually something you see, and there's research to support that people who are nurses who work in hospitals in addiction wings with addiction patients end up becoming kind of burnt out and emotionally exhausted, which leads to less quality care for the people who should be going there to get high quality care from empathetic and trained individuals. And I think that it's a real problem in the kind of cyclical nature of the treatment gets worse because the behavior is overtly negative, which means that the behavior then never gets better because the treatment is worse, and then it kind of cycles on and on and on. Right?
Seek treatment because
right, exactly right.
Yeah. So do you think that this positive empathy can be used in fields like, even medical school where people are being trained?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting. I think it's definitely too early to tell. I think doing a lot of this work and making sure it works in any population, right? Even a heavily controlled lab environment, like I had done for my paper, right? It was not very generalizable at all. It was very much a lab controlled experiment, more of a proof of concept, really. And so I think it's important to kind of prove that the process works, and more importantly, that it works long term. Because if the training works for 2 hours, that's not really going to help anybody in terms of actually impacting any treatment, care, or reducing stigma. If 2 hours after the person that you're training on positive empathy forgets about it and goes on about their day, right? And I think there's another kind of challenge with doing these interventions, which is if the general public or kind of public perception believes one way or one thing, that's a much more powerful force than any individualized interventions. And so a lot of this is about combating public perception, because that's the much more large driving force, that if someone gets these trainings in a lab and then goes out into their life for the other 23 hours of their day and hears a completely different message, that's going to override any of the stuff that we do during the hour training. And so I think it's really trying to figure out about first, if it works, if it does work, how does it work? Like, what exactly is it changing for attitudes? What's the best way to make the effect most powerful? And then finally, how do we make the effect last? And then once we figure out and kind of hammer out those questions, then I think it starts to get to, okay, who should we give this training to? Should we give it to people who use or inject drugs themselves to reduce self-stigma? Should we give it to the people who work with them in hospitals, treatment centers, their kind of bystanders, like caregivers, family, friends, right? Like what population would benefit most from these trainings? But I think that can only be done after we figure out some of the more foundational questions as to whether positive empathy even works as an intervention, at all, which I think is an important consideration.
Yeah, but those studies are so incredibly hard doing longitudinal.
Right.
So I could see it. I can see the challenges to overcome that stuff, and getting funding and getting people on board are hard because it's even now there's very few structural trainings that are continuous and go through. Yeah.
And that was one of the things that we addressed one of the things I addressed in the paper was this idea of one of the conditions for our experimental procedure was testing kind of traditional ignorance reduction methodologies. The idea that you just give someone a bunch of information of, drug use stigma is bad and it affects the people who use drugs poorly. That's a lot of what the trainings are now. Mm-hmm. And so we tested whether or not that information did actually reduce stigma in any kind of meaningful way, as a way to say, look, we're testing what we're doing now to reduce stigma, and it's not significant. It doesn't really work. And so that should be a reason to rethink the way that we're doing these different stigma trainings and to try to come up with new ways, right?
In your research for the paper and everything, did you find that there were still a group of people that held the idea that stigma was a good force to make change in people's life?
Yeah, and not just in the work for the paper, but also some of the stuff for West Virginia University, the project that I worked on, that was the main project. This paper served as kind of a side project, but in working on the main project in Massachusetts on stigma reduction and naloxone access, we interviewed a lot of people who had firsthand accounts, and there was very many people whose lives are directly affected by stigma and drug use who still believed that stigma was good, and that it almost like a scared straight thing, right? Where if you treat these people badly, then that'll motivate them to change their behavior. And I think a lot of the research is in the process of moving beyond that idea. A lot of the research that I found that had the idea that stigma was a good thing was older research, right? And I think the field is starting to move on from that assumption that is true, although you can't speak really in generalizations for anything. And I'm sure there are some different parts of the research who still purport and believe that, right? Which I think is kind of part of the problem, right?
Yeah. Right. And even if the research field tomorrow decides that stigma is bad, that doesn't mean the general public decides that. And that
right. Because it's as you know at LMI, it's very difficult to translate research findings to public perception, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, my final question is something we ask everyone. If you could change or fix one thing in this field, what would you focus on?
That's a good question. I like that question. So here's the thing. It's not exactly related to my research or topic, but it's a problem in psychology that everyone only ever publishes findings that are significant. And I think if I could change one thing about the field of psychology, it's that I would try to make sure that there was room for people doing research, spending money, setting up studies, and then saying that they didn't find something. I think the lack of findings is just as important to the field as the presence of findings. Yeah. But there's this kind of, what's it called? It's like the file cabinet bias, where if something doesn't significant, you just kind of throw it in a file cabinet and you lock it away and it doesn't get published. And I think this pressure and this publication bias for only looking, reading, and disseminating findings that found some significant effects, I think it leads to a lot of deceptive and not great practices in psychology, like manipulating statistics for significance, like p-hacking, doing kind of going back and changing your hypothesis to make what you found match what you wanted to find, kind of thing. And I think if there was room for people to say, look, we tested this and we didn't find anything, I think those findings would be great for the field, and that being able to cite a non-significant research would be a great way to navigate the field and find out what really are gaps, what could be studied, what has been studied but didn't work. And I think it would be good for the field if that could change. So that's my answer.
Yeah, no, I'm not in psychology. I'm studying neuroscience, and even in that, I feel like the lack of transparency in that kind of sense creates so much redundancy in the field that I'm sure there are hundreds of other scientists that got these negative results, but they didn't publish it anywhere. So I have no idea and no way.
Right.
So we have to do years of research for something that's going to not work out. So
right. And I think for neuroscience, especially, neuroscience is almost like an adjacent field to psychology. Yeah, it's like psychology's cooler older brother, right? But I think that field as well, there's a lot of different constructs and things that you can measure and test that have already been measured and tested.
Yeah.
And especially when you're doing neuroscience, right, with MRI machines, like really expensive technology, testing those things again because you don't have the knowledge to know that they've been tested before starts to get very expensive, and it starts to be very prohibitive for someone like just a grad student trying to do research on their own, right, with limited funding or resources. And I think that's a consideration too across both of our different fields.
Yeah, well, I would like to thank you for talking with us today. I think it's been a very helpful and informative interview. So
perfect. Thank you so much for having me.
Taking the time.